we're now moving into the productivity gains phase. So now we're going to talk more around how do we get the most out of this current period, and what can we do to really help our users through this, both from an end user perspective, but also from an infrastructure perspective as well. So we've gone past that reactive, we've gone past risk mitigation. Now it's about, we're in it. Let's deal with it, and let's tackle it head on. So we've got Mike Curtis delivering today. So Mike, I'm going to hand over to you, and this one really is going to be a sort of an open discussion. So please keep the questions flowing throughout. Yeah, all good. So Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ajay. Webinar number 5 in this session. So we said we would have a process. So the thing to say right up front, as some organizations may not have actually moved through those first phases. We've set that as a structure, obviously for the webinar, but people might actually still be in a phase where they're looking at risk mitigations or even still trying to react to the situation as is. It's been a relatively short period of time in terms of a number of weeks. So I thought it was good to kind of say, we're not expecting everybody to have done everything that we've suggested could be done in that short time frame. So when we talk about productivity, as Ajay was saying, the thing that we thought would be useful would be just to kind of dwell on what is productivity and what do we mean, what is it we're talking about in terms of maximizing the kind of workflow gains during this period. So what I thought I'd do would start with saying, what is it? So in the simplest form, the productivity that we're talking about is a measure of the amount of output that can be produced from a unit of input. And within the context of the structure that we've got a labor productivity section, so talking about user productivity, as we said, and then infrastructure. So one of the things historically that's really stopped a lot of organizations from fully embracing a home working environment was that fear that the people were shirking at home rather than working at home, because they didn't really have a way of measuring it. So in the context of how do we help people to think about productivity, we also have to help people to think about how they would measure that productivity. So one of the things that we've said is simplify some ways of being able to analyze how effective you are in the context of the environment that you're now in. So people used to ask me a lot, can I work from home? And I've kind of flipped that question back round and said, I don't know, can you? So the question is back on the individual. Do you have the means to create some output that can demonstrate to management that the productivity is there? So for instance, I'm sure we've all said it ourselves in the past, if only I had some time where I could focus and get this key activity done, I would create more output. I'd get more stuff done. I think we've all said that from time to time. So at an infrastructure level, a unit of measure could be defined as the amount of money that you're paying into your IT infrastructure. So if we go back, I'll show my age a bit, if we go back to the advent of websites, we all used to talk about click rate through our websites and pounds per click. So or clicks per pound rather, how much money were we spending on this new website, how much was it costing us, and how much activity was driving through it. And we had a nice bell curve models for how many users and how much we'd invested. And of course, that's gone forward into e-procurement infrastructure now, and people are talking about, how many products are being purchased through their online purchasing stores and how much revenue they generate for their investment in their infrastructure. So there are ways to measure these things. So that was really my kind of opening gambit with this is, what gets measured gets managed. So if we can look for some simple metrics and ways to measure our productivity, output for labor. So if we think about the labor workforce utilization, one of the things that we find most important is engagement. A workforce that's disengaged create less productivity. So if we now move on to thinking about how we support our users to be productive in those environments, we want our team members to be highly engaged. So we have for many organizations, 5 generations of workers that potentially now have different emphasis on the equipment and the user experience that they receive. So the most junior of us have the highest expectations in terms of their environments working in the same way as their personal environments in terms of the equipment that they use. So the ease and simplicity of use and the availability associated to the things they're using in their personal life, they expect that in the workplace. So part of what we've done is we've talked about the early reaction phases of how we create a workspace environment for people in order to be effective and efficient at working. So what I wanted to do was share some of the tips that may have come out already, but equally stand us in good stead when we're talking about how we create and maintain that level of engagement from our workforce. So basically a few tips that we can have around creating that environment. So the first one, very much at the center, I think, for everyone's focus, because they're sat in it right now, is building their permanent workspace. So on that work from home journey, what are we doing to designate an area of the home for people to work specifically? So for some of us, we have the luxury of spare bedrooms or an area that we can use, a conservatory that we can designate as that home office environment and create a workspace for it. Others, not so much. So one of the tips we've said to people is try to have your workspace away from your main communal area. So obviously take that away from your living room, especially a place with additional screens. So if you have TV, if you're sat in the same room as a television, that's a very big distraction for people. So creating the permanency in that workspace is really important. So we've seen lots of innovative ways that people have created that permanent workspaces. Not everyone had a desk. Some people have knocked desks together out of bits of DIY activity. I heard somebody was using an ironing board to create a desk space for them, so it was away from everyone else in the house in a spare room. But whatever we needed to do at that point when we reacted initially, we tended to think, okay, we have a singular device, our laptop, our connection method, and we're going to work like that. So what we found is giving people efficient workspaces similar to the structure that they have in an office, with additional screens, the right peripherals management, having to keep rebooting the laptop because you've lost the keyboard and mouse because you've got poor peripherals, for instance, and connectivity is a big problem for people. So creating the permanency in that workspace is really, really important, and investing in that technology, as we said. So one of the tips that we have is we ourselves conducted a survey, so a short survey monkey type survey of our staff to ask them how they're feeling during this period. So we've been in it for a few weeks. We've given people some tools. We're very fortunate in the structure that we have in terms of the quality of equipment that we're able to give our users, but we still canvassed those guys to find out where we could be doing more for them, what we could help with. And one of the things that we found at a very, very simple level is people now are finding the limitations of things like their own personal headsets. So the in-ear bud type headphones that people have been using aren't really cutting it over a longer term. They're not helping in terms of creating an environment that's sustainable through the working day. So that's one tip in terms of gaining the feedback from people and looking at how we can help support them. The other thing that we find as well is there is a constant disruption method now. So from an end user's perspective, one of the things that we all believe is that our productivity increases if we can multitask. And actually, the research suggests to us that single tasking is actually the new buzzword in the productivity world. So what we mean by that is degrees of focus. So rather than having 5 things on the go and multiple channels of communication available to us that we've created, we actually want to be able to have the ability to help people to focus and create a task in a sustainable way without the interruption. to actually improve the productivity increase. So a tip is to say to people, choose a single channel for communication, have discipline in that communication channel, know when to turn things off. One of my co-workers said she turns off her notifications around email because it's a constant distraction away from the task in hand. Not when they're in conversation, but just generally when they're trying to commit a task. So actually, that's a discipline I've started for myself, is to try and create a single channel and turn off some of those notification factors. What we've done really highly successfully for most of us is created the same opportunity for interruption in a home working sense, because we're so concerned with being seen to be present and be accessible, and that's created that same structure. You know, the interruptions you'd get in the office, we've now replicated in our home environment, where actually most people, if we go back to what I said in the beginning, oh, if I could only get the time, but without the disruption, I'd be able to create more output. So that's just a mindfulness piece, a bit of a tip. Look at your current working practices, look at your current tools and structure, and see whether or not you've allowed some of that creep in to the home working. I'd be really interested to hear if anyone else is experiencing similar issues with that at the moment. So one of the things that we're going to do is, if you want to chip in, please do. We're saying to people, discover your high productivity periods. There's a lot of advice now around structuring your working day and finding when there are high periods of productivity for you. Some people are energetic in the morning and they structure their day according to that productivity. They have that slump after lunch, so therefore they go into a need to be able to run, say, a task list or a planner. One of the things that we're suggesting people do is stick to one project management app or one planning tool that you share across a group. So one calendarized function, one way of doing things, and set some regularity to that. So developing those routines for people and helping to stick to those regimes. Taking the breaks, as we've said, is very important. Increasingly now, people seem to sit at their desks in their home office for long periods of time because they feel like they need to be present. So making use of the ability to set scheduled timings and be away and sponsor people to say that they're away for a period of time is also a good thing to do in terms of status accounting. That's really good for people. Creating time management, as we said, helping users to understand their time management. So using their tools like their calendarized functions is really important, and helping around structuring things like avoiding clashes with other things that are going on. So lots of invites like this to webinars, but also internal meetings and the structure for output as well. So helping people across that structure is really important. What we've also got in the context of the home working environment is looking for ways in which we can help people to be able to commit tasks more quickly. So we'll go on to a bit about process improvement in the future, but just looking at how people are structuring their own working days in accordance with the activities that we need to be able to get out of people. So helping people to say, okay, defining the first hour of day for email feedback, or looking at the sort of planned activities around reporting, or whatever those functions typically tend to be, rather than leaving people in a structure where they've committed themselves to actually managing their own diary and don't set deadlines. So in an office environment, it can be easier to be able to commit to a deadline. You can get people together and agree tasks to be fulfilled by a certain time. Actually, now we've got a workforce that aren't together and aren't driving to at that. We have to create our own individual timelines and deadlines for things just to be able to uptick on the productivity piece. So if we start thinking about the infrastructure to help with that, if we move on to the next section, infrastructure productivity, one of the things that immediately is different is the context of multitasking. So in an infrastructure sense, you want your sets of infrastructure to be able to multitask and be multi-tenant, whereas as a user, you want to have a single task focus at any particular period of time. So what we've looked at across infrastructure is to think, how can we make best use of the environments that we've got? So we've looked at revising our strategies potentially to look at this as being a sustained way of working in the future. So rather than having a highly disseminated data center strategy and infrastructure environments, we're looking towards hyper-converged infrastructures. How can we pull things together? How can we create less latency between things? How can we simplify the environment? Have we managed to creep into having too much infrastructure to support simple taskings? So where can we consolidate infrastructure to be able to do things in a more simplistic way? What tools and techniques do we have to be able to burst out of that? So things like cloud, how can we use cloud platforms more efficiently and effectively? Many organizations now that weren't looking to cloud as to supplement or be a major part of their infrastructure are now being forced in the current situation to look towards how they would accelerate their access to cloud and putting systems outside of their traditional infrastructure and data center structure in order to be able to keep people on board, have throughput and capacity. So that's a big push for people at the moment, and one of the things that we've looked at ourselves. So creating the ability to be able to simplify infrastructure, but also maintain an availability structure and capacity plan across that in the future. And we've never had a better time at the moment, especially going through this period where it gives people an opportunity to take stock of strategy, to look at core infrastructure, to consider what the new return to normal might be, and then revise their strategy to look at that. So productivity tools in the same context, what we're looking into is how we manage our desktop environment. Now all of our users are disseminated from our office location. So what can we do to proactively manage devices to make sure that we've got the right degree of security, we've done the right patch revisions, we have the right management at an MDM type focus in order to give ourselves an environment that stays performant and end users have the experience that they want from their end user devices. We're lowering the number of issues and incidents that may occur from not managing that device structure. We're looking back into our infrastructures to look at things like backup regimes and data management and risk mitigation activities there to see how can we improve the structures that we have around data. We're also looking at what the support challenges are, having this protracted period of social distancing. So what does that mean in terms of the supportability for infrastructure that we have currently? How can we get on the front foot of managing that such as it doesn't give us failures in our environment, such as we're creating downtime? So how can we avoid that a level of downtime? So if we go right back to the beginning and say, what does productivity mean? Well, in the context of some systems, unavailability diminishes your ability to improve your productivity, clearly. So looking at that is an old term and actually something that I think became less favorable and less in vogue to talk about, but those single points of failure analysis and capacity planning have clearly come straight back into the front of people's minds at the moment in terms of how they have infrastructure to support what they're doing. So if we don't have any questions on that, I'll just pause for a second in case there's any specific questions people have about infrastructure productivity.
I actually have a question for everybody that's on the call. I think it's really interesting. One of the activities we're doing on a regular basis at Bechtle is reviewing our service desk. It's looking very different now. If you look at the types of service desk things with regards to infrastructure issues, user pain points and things like that, they're actually leading us to help people just by seeing a bit of repetition. Now, we all review our service desks and help desks systems, I'm sure, at periodic times, but actually now more than ever, because it's been this dark shift, into the way people work, is actually, it's a good time to review it, because once you understand the sort of problems that are going on, or the shifts that people are doing, you can actually be quite helpful and provide more self-help tools and information. So is everybody reviewing, has everyone taken to reviewing their help desks and service desks more frequently? I'll take silence as yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things with this as well is from an employee engagement perspective, the more self-help that you can produce for people, the better they feel about the situations that they're in. So most people, if they know that there's for instance, a great thing to do is employ some tool automation around password management. So that's a great area. If people can unlock their own passwords via some sort of simplified portal, that reduces things. You know, we always knew that anyway. It was something that lots of organisations have moved to in terms of end user password management. But now with people being remote, even more so. Steps and tips and tricks for how to manage some of the issues that people are experiencing around things like their VPN access, for instance. Also really great areas. So yeah, thanks for that, Justin. That's really good. So if we just canter on and we'd start talking about other areas in terms of process improvement, one of the things that we're starting to think about is reviewing lots of our own business processes to see where we can create some improvement in the positions that we're in currently. So most of this will identify areas for replacing manual data entry and input. So we at Bechtle have some processes that we would love to automate. So that means we're starting to look at ways in which we can use things like robotic process automation, tooling around some limited focused AI activity, maybe put in some automated assistance at the front end of our service desk structure, for instance. I know many companies have looked to having the sort of chatbot type structures in place, but equally we're starting to see definitely that there are opportunities there to create more output from automation. We're starting to look at how we can create simplified processes where, as we say, we're removing the waste from that system. So where do we have things that we are doing that actually don't provide us benefit as an output? Can we reduce the amount of effort being associated to that? So from a time management perspective, if, for instance, we'll just use an example of surveyors. If we were a firm and we had surveyors and they had 8 hours of productive time to survey, but we found they were spending 2 hours a day of manual data input against the survey results. Actually, if we could create an environment where we can automate some of the process of that data management, digitalize some of what they're doing on an analog basis, and then move that through, we can reduce that time. We get a productivity increase because we're using system automation in order to help that. So right now, it's never been a better time to review business process and look at where you can use technology to help automate part of that process. Two benefits to that: obviously the increase in throughput for the actual task that you want at the end of it, but also from an employee engagement perspective and value, we're increasing the human capital value by removing them, our end users, from the drudgery of manual data input or poring over reporting or trying to produce statistics. So things like management information tools, Power BI, those types of structures, and looking at where we can use those more extensively to create the information that we need in order to have more real-time information at the front of what we're doing, rather than the lag into historical reporting, which is great and interesting, but actually is not helping us to make decisions and do the right things as we move forward as well. So also looking at where we might be able to create and dare I say the term, in a DevOps type way, but actually looking at really just the automation of some of those processes for update management. So in your desktop environment, in your backend server estate. What can we do to create that continuous integration and that continuous update and management processes? So where we would have manual process for doing some of this stuff, what can we do to make sure that we've eliminated the need for humans to do that sort of more mundane activity that's very necessary, but is a bit of a productivity sap at the end of the day. So lots of areas in there to look at, lots of interesting stuff, time to be able to take stock, to revisit some of these things, some real basic principles in there from an end user perspective. But I think we want to pause at that point and see if there's questions from people or observations that they're having. We'd like to hear from people in terms of what they're experiencing and what they've done to mitigate some of the issues that have affected productivity for them.